The morning of April 6, 1945. Radar Picket Station, Number 1, 60 miles north of Okinawa. Lieutenant Commander Beckton stands on the bridge of USS Laffey, a Fletcher-Class destroyer, watching the radar scope paint targets that make his blood run cold. 22 incoming aircraft, then 30, then 50. His ship carries 5 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets, each capable of firing 15 rounds per minute under normal conditions. But these aren't normal conditions. His crew has trained for this moment, drilling until loading and firing became muscle memory. They know these guns can do something the Japanese don't expect. 22 rounds per minute. For the next 80 minutes, Laffey will prove what American industrial might and crew training can accomplish when every second counts. The question isn't whether Fletcher-Class destroyers were good ships. By 1945, everyone knew they were. The question is whether 5 guns firing faster than anything the Japanese had ever encountered could stop waves of pilots who had no intention of returning home, because that's what kamikaze means, not just divine wind. It means the pilot climbing into that cockpit has already written his farewell letters. The aircraft carrying him toward your ship isn't trying to drop a bomb and escape. It's trying to become a bomb. And when you're a destroyer on picket duty, you're the first thing those pilots see. The Fletcher-Class destroyer was born from dissatisfaction. In 1939, the United States Navy looked at its destroyer fleet and didn't like what it saw. The Porter and Summers classes were destroyer leaders, larger and more complex than the Navy wanted. The previous Benson and Gleaves classes were capable ships, but the admirals wanted more firepower, more range, and more adaptability for the vast Pacific distances they knew war would demand. The design bureaus at the Navy's offices circulated questionnaires. How many guns do you need? How many torpedo tubes? How much depth charge capacity? At what point does a destroyer become too large to be effective? The answers came back consistent. 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 torpedo tubes, substantial anti-aircraft armament, and enough fuel capacity to operate 6,500 nautical miles from base. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The result was a ship 376 feet long, with a flush deck design that added structural strength. Displacing 2,050 tons standard and over 2,500 tons fully loaded, these were large destroyers. The power plant delivered 60,000 shaft horsepower through 2 propellers, giving a design speed of 38 knots. Fast enough to screen carriers, powerful enough to fight surface actions, and versatile enough to hunt submarines or bombard shore positions. But the heart of the Fletcher-Class was those 5 5-inch guns. The Mark 12 5-inch, 38 caliber gun wasn't new technology in 1942. The Navy had been mounting these weapons since the mid-1930s. What made them revolutionary was the combination of the gun itself with the fire control system and the training of American gun crews. Each gun sat in an enclosed Mark 30 mounting. The barrel was 5 inches in diameter and 38 calibers long, meaning the barrel length was 190 inches, just short of 16 feet. The gun fired a semi-fixed round, a 54-pound projectile paired with a 28-pound shell casing containing 15 pounds of powder. The initial velocity was 2,600 feet per second. Maximum range against surface targets was 18,200 yards. Maximum ceiling for anti-aircraft fire was 37,200 feet. The technical specifications matter because they explain what happened when these guns faced kamikaze attacks. The gun's versatility was extraordinary. The same weapon could engage aircraft at high elevation or surface targets at low angle. The mounting could train at 25 degrees per second and elevate from -15 degrees to +85 degrees at 15 degrees per second. This meant the gun could track a maneuvering aircraft through radical course changes. The loading system was the key to the weapon's effectiveness. An electric hydraulic power rammer used 7.5 horsepower to ram the 93-pound round, projectile and powder case combined, into the chamber at any elevation angle in less than 1 second. This was critical. Many naval guns could only be loaded at specific angles, forcing the gun to return to loading position after each shot. The Fletcher's 5-inch guns could be loaded at maximum elevation while tracking an aircraft diving toward the ship. No pause. No repositioning. Just continuous fire. The base ring mounts with integral ammunition hoists had a nominal rate of fire of 15 rounds per minute per barrel. But here's where American training culture made the difference. With a well-drilled crews that practiced until every movement was automatic, 22 rounds per minute was achievable for short bursts. Inside each gun mount, 11 men worked in choreographed precision. The mount captain commanded the crew. The pointer controlled elevation. The trainer controlled the traverse. Projectile men handled the shells. Powder men handled the propellant cases. The fuse setter man operated the mechanism that armed the projectile's fuse. The hot shell man removed spent brass casings ejected from the breech. The sight setter adjusted the gun's optical sighting system. 2 additional men passed ammunition from the ready service lockers to the loading positions. 11 men. 93 pounds of ammunition per shot. In a confined steel chamber that heated rapidly with sustained fire, the brass casings ejected through the back of the mount at elevations up to 35 degrees, clanging onto the deck in a constant rain of spent metal. At maximum rate of fire, the mount filled with cordite smoke despite the ventilation system. The temperature inside could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was physically painful, but those crews kept loading, kept firing, because they understood what was coming toward them. The ammunition itself told part of the story. Fletcher-Class destroyers typically carried 525 rounds per gun in the magazines, plus 50 ready rounds per gun, totaling 575 rounds per weapon. That's 2,875 rounds of 5-inch ammunition aboard ship. When you're firing 22 rounds per minute, you can empty a gun's ready ammunition in just over 2 minutes. Then the crews had to rely on the hoists bringing shells up from the magazines below. 2 types of anti-aircraft ammunition dominated the load by 1944. The AA common projectile was a 55-pound shell with a mechanical time fuse. The fuse was set before firing, calculated to detonate the shell at a specific time after leaving the gun. This created a pattern of shrapnel at a predetermined altitude. Fire control officers would set the fuses based on the target's observed altitude and calculated time of flight. The smoke puffs from these bursts served 2 purposes. They created lethal fragments that could damage or destroy aircraft, and they provided visual reference points that allowed fire control officers to adjust their solutions. But the real revolution came with the VT fuse, variable time, proximity fuse. By mid-1944, Fletcher-Class destroyers were loading 3 VT rounds for every 1 AA common round. These proximity fuses were technological marvels, miniaturized radar sets inside a shell nose that detected nearby aircraft and detonated automatically. Instead of hoping your timed fuse matched the aircraft's actual position, the proximity fuse guaranteed detonation when an aircraft was within 70 feet. The combination of proximity-fused ammunition and 22 rounds per minute changed the mathematics of air defense dramatically. The Mark 37 gun-fire control system coordinated all 5 guns. Mounted atop the pilot house, the director housing contained radar systems, optical rangefinders, and a ballistic computer. The Mark 12 fire control radar tracked targets. The Mark 22 height finder determined altitude, later replaced by the circular Mark 25 radar. The Mark 1A fire control computer processed all the data, tracking information, target speed, course, altitude, wind conditions, ship's motion, and generated firing solutions. The Mark 6 gyroscope stabilized the entire system despite the ship's rolling and pitching. When the system worked properly, all 5 guns tracked the same target and fired as one battery. The director calculated the lead angle, the point in space where the target would be when the shells arrived, and the guns fired there. Even when a kamikaze was maneuvering violently, the computer adjusted continuously. Human gunners simply couldn't track and aim fast enough. The mechanical computer could. This combination, the gun, the mount, the fire control system, the ammunition, and most critically, the trained crew, created a weapons platform that could put 110 rounds into the air per minute when all 5 guns were firing at maximum rate. 110 55-pound projectiles, each one capable of bringing down an aircraft, all guided by a central computer system that made continuous adjustments. That's what the Japanese were flying into when they approached a Fletcher-Class destroyer. But having the capability wasn't enough. The crews had to use it effectively under conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. Because kamikaze attacks weren't orderly affairs where targets appeared one at a time, they were coordinated mass assaults designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. And by April 1945, the Japanese had refined kamikaze tactics to a brutal efficiency. The Pacific War had been grinding toward Japan for 3 years by the time Okinawa became the next objective. The island sat just 340 miles from the Japanese home islands. Capturing it would provide airfields for bombers to strike Japan itself and anchorages for the vast fleet that would support an invasion. The Japanese understood this perfectly. They also understood they couldn't stop the invasion through conventional means. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost most of its carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The remnants of the surface fleet had been shattered at Leyte Gulf in October. By 1945, Japan's naval air power consisted of land-based aircraft flown by pilots with minimal training. In October 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had proposed a solution to this problem. Organized suicide attacks. If pilots were being shot down anyway before they could deliver their weapons, why not guarantee a hit by crashing directly into the target? A Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter, cost approximately $50,000 to build. Add in pilot training, fuel, maintenance, and operational costs, and each aircraft represented an investment near $100,000. Under normal doctrine, that investment was meant to be reused. The pilot would attack, disengage if the situation became untenable, and return to fight another day. But by late 1944, Japanese pilots weren't surviving long enough to build experience. American aircraft were superior, American pilots were better trained. American numbers were overwhelming. The cold mathematics said that if a pilot had only a small percentage chance of hitting a target before being shot down, eliminating the return flight and guaranteeing the hit made economic sense in a desperate nation's calculus. The term kamikaze referenced the divine winds, typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281. The name carried spiritual weight. These weren't just suicide missions. They were sacred acts meant to save the empire. The first organized kamikaze unit, the Shimpu Special Attack Corps, launched on October 25, 1944. Of 26 aircraft that took off from Philippine airfields, only 5 reached their targets. But those 5 aircraft caused catastrophic damage. The escort carrier USS St. Lo took a direct hit and sank within 30 minutes. Suddenly, that $100,000 investment had destroyed a $50 million ship and killed 114 sailors. The tactical implications were clear. A damaged conventional attack lost effectiveness. A bomber with one engine out would break off the attack and try to return home, but a kamikaze with one engine out would continue the dive. Even if anti-aircraft fire killed the pilot, momentum would carry the aircraft toward the target. Even if the aircraft was burning, breaking apart, its control surfaces shot away. Simple physics meant it was still a guided missile until it hit something or crashed into the ocean. This fundamentally changed defensive doctrine. Traditional air defense assumed that if you damaged an enemy aircraft sufficiently, it would abort the attack. Kamikaze doctrine meant the attack continued until the aircraft physically disintegrated or struck its target. American naval commanders immediately grasped the nightmare this created. Every previous air attack involved pilots who wanted to survive, pilots who would dodge, weave, take evasive action when faced with heavy fire. Kamikaze pilots were trained to press straight through defensive fire to reach their targets. The psychological impact matched the tactical challenge. American sailors had faced enemy fire for years, but watching an aircraft continue its dive even after being hit multiple times, even after catching fire, knowing the pilot was deliberately aiming for your exact position, created a unique kind of horror. Japan ramped up kamikaze production through late 1944 and into 1945. They didn't need sophisticated aircraft. Even obsolete trainers could be loaded with explosives and flown on one-way missions. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka was essentially a piloted rocket bomb that cost just $35,000 to produce. It was cheaper, simpler, and in its own horrific way, sometimes more effective than conventional bombers when it reached its target. By the time the invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, the Japanese had stockpiled thousands of aircraft for kamikaze missions. The plan was simple and brutal: launch massive coordinated attacks called kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, against the American fleet. Sink enough ships, kill enough sailors, and perhaps the Americans would decide the cost of invading Japan itself was too high. The statistics from Okinawa tell you everything about the scale of this campaign. Over 82 days, Japan would launch nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties. The Americans assembled the most powerful naval force in history to support the invasion. 11 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 22 escort carriers, 8 fast battleships, 10 old battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 132 destroyers, and supporting vessels that brought the total to over 1,500 ships. Those destroyers were critical to the defense plan. Radar picket stations were established in a ring 60 to 80 miles from the main fleet. Destroyers, primarily Fletcher-Class ships, would station themselves at these pickets with supporting landing craft. Their mission was to provide early warning of incoming kamikaze attacks through their radar systems and to shoot down as many aircraft as possible before they reached the high-value targets, the carriers and battleships anchored off Okinawa's shores. It was a mission that made perfect tactical sense and amounted to a death sentence for many destroyer crews. The first Kikusui attack began on April 6. 355 kamikaze aircraft launched simultaneously across a 50-mile front. The radar picket destroyers saw them coming. The combat air patrol, Corsair and Hellcat fighters flying constant coverage over the fleet, intercepted many. But the sheer numbers meant some would inevitably break through to the destroyers below. Those destroyers were about to demonstrate what Fletcher-Class guns could do. USS Laffey at Radar Picket Station No. 1 became the face of this battle. An Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, not a Fletcher, but armed with the Great, same 5-inch, 38-caliber guns in twin mounts instead of single mountings, 6 guns total instead of 5. Lieutenant Commander F. Julian Beckton commanded. His crew had trained extensively, drilling on the guns until the movements were automatic. They would need every bit of that training. The first wave appeared on radar at 0700. Combat Air Patrol engaged immediately, shooting down several kamikazes before they reached the destroyer. But more kept coming. At 0742, the first kamikaze began its dive on Laffey. The 5-inch guns opened fire. The 40mm Bofors guns joined in. Then the 20mm Oerlikons. The volume of fire was staggering, a curtain of steel and high explosive that the kamikaze had to penetrate to reach the ship. The first aircraft caught fire and crashed into the sea just off the port bow. The crew barely had time to celebrate before the next one appeared, and then another, and another. For the next hour and 20 minutes, Laffey would face 22 individual kamikaze attacks. Her guns never stopped firing. The 5-inch mounts were the primary defense. At ranges beyond 2,000 yards, they were the only weapons with enough hitting power to reliably destroy an incoming aircraft. The Mark 37 Director tracked targets continuously. As each gun mount emptied its ready ammunition, the crews relied on the hoists, bringing shells up from the magazines. The mount captains coordinated their crews through voice tubes and sound-powered phones. Load, fire, eject, load, fire, eject. The rhythm became everything. 9 kamikazes were shot down by Laffey's guns and the combat air patrol, but 5 struck the ship. 4 bombs hit. The damage was catastrophic. 32 men died. 71 were wounded. The after-steering room was destroyed. The radar was knocked out. Fires raged across the ship. But Laffey stayed afloat, and her guns kept firing until the attacks finally ended. After-action reports analysed what happened. The 5-inch guns had fired continuously for 80 minutes. The exact number of rounds fired wasn't recorded in the chaos, but survivors estimated each gun crew maintained close to maximum rate of fire for most of the engagement. That meant somewhere near 1,800 rounds of 5-inch ammunition expended, against 22 attacking aircraft. The guns had shot down 9 confirmed. The combat air patrol got several more, but the sheer volume of fire, even from aircraft that completed their attack runs and hit the ship, was already damaged by anti-aircraft fire. They were burning, they were shredded, their pilots were likely dead or wounded. They hit through momentum and mass, not because they successfully penetrated unharmed. This pattern repeated across the radar picket stations. Fletcher-Class destroyers like USS Bush, USS Colquhoun, USS Pringle faced similar mass attacks. Many were sunk or damaged beyond repair, but before they went down, their 5-inch guns extracted a terrible toll on the attacking Kamikazes, USS Hugh W. Hadley, another Fletcher-Class destroyer at Radar Picket Station 15 on May 11th, faced perhaps the most intense action of any destroyer during the Okinawa campaign. Over a 40-minute period, Hadley and her companion destroyer, USS Evans, engaged an estimated 156 Japanese aircraft. The combat air patrol was overhead, but the kamikazes came in waves that overwhelmed the fighters. Hadley's guns went into continuous fire. All 5 5-inch mounts trained and fired as fast as the crews could load. The 40mm mounts added their contribution. The 20mm guns created a close-in defense that was literally the last line before impact. Hadley's crew shot down at least 20 aircraft themselves, possibly more. The combat air patrol destroyed dozens more, but some got through. 1 kamikaze struck Hadley's waterline, another hit amidships. A 3rd aircraft, already burning from hits, crashed into the ship after the pilot was dead. Hadley survived, barely, but was so badly damaged she never returned to combat. Her 5-inch guns had proven what they could do. They had taken down aircraft at ranges where the smaller guns couldn't reach. They had maintained fire rates that the Japanese hadn't anticipated, and they had done it with a crew that refused to stop fighting even when the ship was flooding and burning. The statistical analysis from Okinawa reveals the Fletcher-Class performance. Of the 132 destroyers in the American fleet, a significant number were Fletcher-Class ships. 17 Fletcher-Class destroyers were sunk or declared constructive total losses between March and July 1945. All of them fell to kamikaze attacks or related action. USS De Haven, Strong, Morrison, Luce, Little, Bush, Colquhoun, Pringle, William D. Porter, Twiggs, Callahan. Each name represented a ship and a crew that fought to the end. But focus on what happened before these ships went down. The average Fletcher-Class destroyer on picket duty at Okinawa engaged dozens of kamikaze aircraft during the campaign. Many ships shot down more aircraft than they had 5-inch gun mounts. USS Newcomb, heavily damaged by 5 kamikaze hits on April 6th, had shot down 7 aircraft before being overwhelmed. Her guns were still firing even as the ship was flooding and burning. The Japanese noticed. After-action intelligence gathered from interrogations of captured pilots and analysis of Japanese radio communications revealed a pattern. Kamikaze pilots were reporting that American destroyer fire was far heavier than anticipated. Some missions were specifically briefed to avoid the radar picket destroyers if possible and target the larger ships behind them. The problem was the pickets were positioned precisely to make that impossible. To reach the carriers and battleships, the kamikazes had to fly through the destroyer screen, and that meant flying through a volume of fire that very few aircraft could survive. The rate of fire was critical. At 15 rounds per minute, a single 5-inch gun on a Fletcher-Class destroyer could put 15 shells into the air between the time a kamikaze began its final dive and the moment it either hit the ship or crashed into the ocean. With 5 guns, that's 75 shells. At the maximum rate of 22 rounds per minute, that number increased to 110 shells. Each shell carried the proximity fuse that would detonate within 70 feet of an aircraft. The effective engagement envelope extended from 18,000 yards, over 10 miles, down to point-blank range. At extreme range, the shells needed time to reach altitude, and the fire control solution had to account for long flight times. But at mid-range, 2,000 to 5,000 yards, the system was devastatingly effective. The shell's flight time was short, the target's motion was predictable, and the proximity fuse guaranteed that any shell passing near the aircraft would detonate. Japanese pilots who survived kamikaze missions and were captured, or who wrote final letters before their missions, described the defensive fire in terms that revealed their shock. Walls of explosions. Continuous bursts that made it impossible to fly through unscathed. One pilot's letter, recovered after the war, described American destroyers as fortresses that spit fire continuously like dragons. The metaphor was revealing. In Japanese tactical planning before the war, destroyers were considered primarily anti-ship platforms, nimble torpedo attackers that relied on speed and surprise. The idea that a destroyer could function as an anti-aircraft fortress, maintaining continuous fire for extended periods, hadn't been fully appreciated until Okinawa. The American training culture created this capability. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized spirit, courage, and dedication. These qualities were genuine and produced pilots willing to die for their mission. But American doctrine emphasized technical proficiency, systematic training, and crew coordination. A Fletcher-Class destroyer's gun crew didn't rely on spirit to fire 22 rounds per minute. They relied on drills repeated until muscle memory took over, on standardized procedures that ensured every man knew his exact role, and on equipment maintained to eliminate failures. Consider what happened inside a 5-inch gun mount during sustained action. The temperature exceeded 100 degrees. Cordite smoke limited visibility, even with ventilation. The noise was physically damaging. Spent brass casings were piling up on the deck. The men were exhausted. Adrenaline could only sustain you for so long. But the training was held. The procedures held. Load the shell nose first into the loading tray. The power rammer drives it into the chamber. Load the powder casing behind it. Close the breech. The gun fires. Automatically, when the fire control solution aligns, the breech opens. The spent casing ejects. Start again. Every man in the mount knew his role so thoroughly that he could perform it while exhausted, deafened, and terrified. The logistics behind this performance were equally impressive. Each Fletcher-Class destroyer carried 575 rounds per 5-inch gun. That's 2,875 rounds total for all 5 guns. During intense action at Okinawa, some destroyers expended their entire 5-inch ammunition supply and had to withdraw for resupply. USS Richard P. Leary expended over 4,000 rounds per gun during the campaign, requiring barrel replacements due to wear. The barrels were rated for 4,600 effective full charges before accuracy degraded. Shooting over 4,000 rounds meant the gun was approaching the end of its service life, but it was still firing. The ammunition supply chain stretched back to the United States during 1945. American factories produced millions of 5-inch shells. The proximity fuses alone represented a massive industrial effort. By the Okinawa campaign, production had reached over 1 million proximity fuses per month. Each fuse contained miniaturized vacuum tubes, batteries, and electronics that had to survive the 20,000 G acceleration of being fired from a gun. Quality control rejected any fuse that didn't meet specifications, but the rejection rate was kept below 2%. 98 out of every 100 fuses worked perfectly when needed. This industrial capability meant that every Fletcher-Class destroyer at Okinawa had access to essentially unlimited ammunition as long as they could reach a supply ship. The tenders and ammunition ships stationed at Kirama-Reto, a small island group near Okinawa, could reload a destroyer's magazines in less than 48 hours. A Fletcher would expend its ammunition load on picket duty, steam to Kirama-Reto, reload, refuel, make emergency repairs if needed, and return to the picket line. The cycle continued for months. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese kamikaze strategy at Okinawa aimed to create a war of attrition. Sink enough ships, kill enough sailors, and force the Americans to conclude that invasion of Japan would cost too much blood. The mathematics behind this strategy assumed that each kamikaze mission would result in significant damage to an American ship. If 10 aircraft attacked and 3 succeeded in hitting targets, and each hit caused serious damage, then launching 2,000 kamikaze sorties should devastate the fleet. But the Fletcher-Class destroyers and their sister ships disrupted this calculation. The rate at which American anti-aircraft fire destroyed incoming kamikazes exceeded Japanese planning estimates. Intelligence reports from earlier in the war had suggested that American anti-aircraft defenses could be saturated by mass attacks. This had proven partially true at places like the Philippine Sea, but by Okinawa, the combination of improved fire control systems, proximity-fused ammunition, and extensively trained gun crews created a defensive capability that changed the mathematics. During the 10 major Kikusui attacks at Okinawa between April 6 and June 22, Japan launched 1,500 kamikaze aircraft in coordinated mass raids. American records document 30 ships sunk and 368 damaged. Those are significant losses. But consider the ratio: 1,500 attacking aircraft, 30 ships sunk. That's a 50-to-1 ratio. Even counting the damaged ships, it's roughly a 4-to-1 ratio of aircraft expended per ship hit. The Fletcher-Class destroyers on the radar picket line absorbed much of this attack. They were positioned specifically to intercept kamikazes before they reached the high-value targets. And while many Fletchers were sunk or damaged, they succeeded in their mission. The carriers and battleships anchored off Okinawa continued operating. The invasion proceeded. The logistics continued flowing. Japan's strategy of creating unacceptable losses through kamikaze attacks failed to achieve its objective. The Fletcher crews who survived Okinawa understood what they had accomplished. In memoirs and interviews recorded decades later, survivors described the experience in terms that revealed both the horror of facing kamikaze attacks and the confidence they had in their ships and their training. One gun mount captain from USS Kidd, a Fletcher-Class destroyer that survived multiple kamikaze attacks, recalled, "We knew if we kept the guns firing, we had a chance. Stop shooting, and you die. It was that simple." This mentality pervaded the destroyer crews. The 5-inch guns represented life, as long as they were. Firing, as long as the shells were going downrange, the ship had a chance to survive. The moment the guns went silent, whether from damage or ammunition exhaustion, the ship became vulnerable. So the crews kept loading, kept firing, through exhaustion and fear, and the physical punishment of sustained combat. The gun barrels heated with continuous fire. After 50 rounds in rapid succession, the barrel temperature could exceed safe limits. Standard procedure called for allowing the barrel to cool. During kamikaze attacks, that procedure was ignored. The guns fired until they malfunctioned or until the attack ended. Some ships reported barrels that had fired so many rounds so quickly that the rifling showed visible wear when inspected after battle. The Navy accepted this. Barrels could be replaced. Ships and crews couldn't. The Fletcher-Class design proved remarkably resilient. Ships that were hit by kamikazes, ships that by all logical assessment should have sunk, somehow stayed afloat. USS Newcomb took 5 kamikaze hits in a 90-minute attack and didn't sink. The ship was effectively destroyed, declared a constructive total loss after returning to port, but it floated. The flush deck design distributed structural loads effectively. The compartmentalization limited flooding. The damage control training meant that crews could contain fires and prevent progressive flooding even while under continued attack. Not all Fletchers were so fortunate. USS Pringle took a single kamikaze hit on April 16th and broke in half, sinking in 6 minutes. The aircraft struck directly in the forward fire room, and the resulting explosion broke the ship's keel. 113 men died. But even in Pringle's case, the ship's guns had been firing continuously up until the moment of impact. The 5-inch mounts shot down several aircraft before the one that killed the ship penetrated the defences. The aerial perspective reveals the scope of what these ships faced. Imagine being a kamikaze pilot approaching Okinawa from the north. You're flying at 8,000 feet, conserving altitude for your final dive. Your aircraft is loaded with a 500-pound bomb. You've been flying for over an hour from your base in Kyushu. Your training consisted of 20 hours of flight instruction, just enough to take off, fly straight, and dive into a target. You can't navigate well. You're depending on following the more experienced pilots in your formation. You spot the American fleet ahead. The carriers are visible, massive ships surrounded by escorts. That's your target. But between you and them are the radar picket destroyers. The moment the destroyer's radar tracks you, the calculation starts. The fire control computer processes your course, speed, and altitude. The 5-inch guns train toward your position. You're still 8 miles away. You begin your dive. The first shells explode around you at 6 miles. Black puffs of smoke appear in your path. You adjust course. The explosions follow. At 4 miles, the volume increases. The shells are detonating with proximity fuses. You don't understand this technology. You just know that the sky is filled with explosions that seem to track your every movement. At 2 miles, you're committed to the dive. You push the stick forward, aiming for the destroyer below. The explosions are continuous now. Something hits your wing. The aircraft shudders but stays airborne. Something else hits the engine. Fire erupts from the cowling. You're still diving. Another hit. The controls go slack. You're no longer flying the aircraft. You're just a passenger in a burning metal coffin that gravity is pulling toward the ocean. You never reach the destroyer. The aircraft impacts the water 200 yards from the ship's port side. This scenario played out hundreds of times in Okinawa. For every kamikaze that successfully hit a ship, several more were destroyed before reaching attack range. The Fletcher-Class 5-inch guns created a defensive zone that extended miles from the ship. Any aircraft entering that zone faced continuous fire that only increased in intensity as the range closed. The Japanese adjusted tactics. Early in the Okinawa campaign, kamikazes approached at medium altitude, 8 to 10,000 feet, which gave them time to spot targets and select approach angles. The American radar tracked them easily at these altitudes, giving the fire control systems extended engagement time. So, later attacks shifted to low-altitude approaches, sometimes just above the water, to reduce radar detection time and limit the engagement window. The Fletcher crews adapted. The Mark 37 Director could track low-flying targets, though the radar had difficulty picking up aircraft against the sea return clutter. So spotters with binoculars became critical. When radar couldn't acquire the target, the gun mounts shifted to local control. The mount captain would aim manually, using optical sights. The accuracy decreased, but volume of fire compensated. All 5 guns would fire at the observed target position, creating a pattern of bursts that the aircraft would have to fly through. Another Japanese adaptation was the use of obsolete aircraft. Late model Zero fighters and modern bombers were increasingly scarce, so the kamikaze units began using trainers, obsolete biplanes, even floatplanes. These aircraft were slower, which made them easier to hit, but they were also more available. The Yokosuka K-5Y, a biplane trainer called Willow by American intelligence, became surprisingly common in later kamikaze attacks. These biplanes could barely exceed 100 knots, but they were hard to track on radar due to their wood and fabric construction, and their slow speed meant they could maneuver tightly at low altitude. USS Callahan, a Fletcher-Class destroyer, was sunk by a K-5Y biplane on July 29, 1945, the last ship sunk in World War I. The biplane approached at night, flying low over the water. Callahan's radar didn't acquire the target until it was within a mile. The 5-inch guns opened fire, but the engagement time was insufficient. The biplane crashed into the ship, and the resulting fire and explosion caused flooding that couldn't be controlled. Callahan sank, and 73 men died. Even in failure, the story reveals the system's effectiveness. That biplane succeeded because it exploited the few vulnerabilities the Fletcher-Class defense had. Night operations reduced visual acquisition time. Low altitude reduced radar effectiveness. Slow speed meant the aircraft could adjust course even under fire. And luck, random chance, meant the aircraft wasn't hit during the brief engagement window. Under daylight conditions with normal approach profiles, that biplane would have been destroyed miles from the ship. The cumulative effect of Fletcher-Class destroyer performance at Okinawa was strategic. Japan's Kamikaze campaign was supposed to create unacceptable losses that would force a negotiated end to the war. Instead, the campaign revealed that even suicide tactics couldn't overcome American material and technical advantages. Yes, destroyers were sunk. Yes, sailors died. But the fleet continued operating. The invasion succeeded, and the ratio of American losses to Japanese effort was far lower than Japanese planning had anticipated. Japanese naval intelligence after Okinawa attempted to assess what had gone wrong. Reports noted that American anti-aircraft fire was far more effective than projected. Specific mention was made of destroyer fire being unexpectedly heavy. Some reports estimated that American destroyers were firing anti-aircraft ammunition at rates that exceeded Japanese estimates by a factor of 2. The Japanese analysts didn't know about the 22 rounds per minute capability. They were calculating based on observed volumes of fire and coming to the conclusion that American guns were somehow faster than Japanese intelligence had reported. In reality, the Fletcher-Class 5-inch gun's maximum rate of fire had been documented in technical intelligence captured from earlier in the war. Japanese analysts had the specifications. What they hadn't accounted for was American crew training allowing sustained fire at maximum rates for extended periods. Japanese doctrine assumed that maximum rates of fire were brief bursts, sustained for perhaps 1 or 2 minutes before crew fatigue forced a reduction. American crews were maintaining 20-plus rounds per minute for 10, 20, even 30 minutes during massed attacks. The cultural difference manifested in training approaches. Japanese naval gunnery training emphasized precision. Accuracy was paramount. Rate of fire was secondary. American training emphasized both accuracy and volume. The philosophy was that a high volume of accurate fire was more effective than a lower volume of perfectly precise fire. This made sense with proximity-fused ammunition. You didn't need to hit the aircraft directly. You needed to get shells close enough that the fuse would detonate, and that meant saturating the target area with as many shells as possible. The Fletcher-Class destroyer embodied this philosophy. The guns could fire fast. The fire control system was accurate enough, the ammunition was sophisticated enough, and the crews were trained well enough. Put these elements together, and you created a weapons platform that exceeded what Japanese tactical planning had considered possible. After Okinawa, the kamikaze threat didn't disappear. Japan was stockpiling thousands of aircraft for the defense of the home islands. The planned invasion, Operation Downfall, anticipated kamikaze attacks on a scale that would dwarf Okinawa. Estimates suggested 10,000 aircraft dedicated to kamikaze missions. The Fletcher-Class destroyers would have formed the first line of defense again, positioned in radar picket stations around the invasion beaches. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Downfall became necessary. We'll never know how that invasion would have unfolded, but based on the Okinawa performance, the Fletcher-Class destroyers would have performed their mission. Many would have been sunk, many more sailors would have died, but the guns would have kept firing, and the invasion would have proceeded. The legacy of the Fletcher-Class destroyer extends beyond World War II. Of the 175 ships commissioned, the majority survived the war. Many served in Korea, where their 5-inch guns proved equally effective in shore bombardment roles. Some served into the 1970s, more than 30 years after their construction. Several were transferred to Allied navies and served even longer. The last Fletcher in service, Bam-Quitlahuac, formerly USS John Rogers, left the Mexican Navy in 2001. That meant the class had a service life spanning almost 6 decades, but the peak of their achievement was Okinawa, the battle where 5-inch guns firing 22 rounds per minute faced thousands of pilots willing to die. The battle where American industrial might, technical sophistication, and crew training combined to create a defensive capability that even suicide tactics couldn't overcome. The battle where the mathematics of naval warfare shifted permanently, proving that technology and training could counter fanaticism and courage. The crews who manned those guns understood what they had accomplished. They knew they had faced an enemy who couldn't be intimidated, who wouldn't break off attacks, who would press home their runs even while burning and dying. And they knew they had stopped them. Not every time, not perfectly, but enough. They had kept firing when every instinct said to take cover. They had maintained discipline when chaos surrounded them. They had trusted their training when fear threatened to overwhelm reason. That's the story behind the title. Japan was stunned by Fletcher-Class 5-inch guns firing 22 rounds per minute at kamikazes. Not because the Japanese didn't know the guns could fire that fast. The technical specifications were available. They were stunned because they hadn't believed American crews could sustain that rate of fire under combat conditions. They hadn't accounted for the training culture that turned maximum specifications into operational reality. They hadn't understood that American naval doctrine had created a system where the ship, the weapon, the ammunition, and the crew functioned as one integrated whole. The 5-inch gun was just steel and mechanisms. The proximity fuse was just electronics and explosives. The Mark 37 director was just computers and radar. But combined with crews who had drilled until they could load and fire while exhausted, terrified, and under attack, these components became something the Japanese hadn't encountered before. They became a weapon system that could face kamikaze attacks and survive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.